Hello, Halo fans. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're on episode 16. I can't believe we've done that many already. It seems like, just a few months ago we were just starting this. But today I'm again joined by my good friend Noah, if you want to say hi.
Hello again, everyone.
Today's topic is, again, one that was actually requested by someone on YouTube in the comment section. And it's about a character or a person in the Halo universe that I feel really does not get enough due diligence for how big and how extensive their story arc really is. Contrary to what many fans, or at least people who've played Halo, might think, Mdama, who we're going to be covering today, actually has a very unique story arc, and his background as well as the actions of which he takes throughout Halo 4 and the Spartan Ops, and unfortunately with this end in Halo 5, is all that many people actually see about him. Contrary to that, we actually know through reading Halo Escalation, which are the comic books by Dark Horse Comics, as well as the Kilo 5 trilogy, which covers some other extensive characters throughout the Halo universe, including Mdama, some backstory and history to this character that gives him a whole new level of perspective that I feel like many people have not seen before. And in the end, with Halo 5, I feel doesn't give him the due diligence that he deserved, at least during his death at the beginning of that game. So, starting this podcast off, I kind of want to talk about his early life and his military career. Mdama was born on March 5th, 2489, which is quite early in the realm of Halo. The Contact Harvest actually starts in 2525, which means that he was born at least 15, 20 years before that. And by the time of the Human Covenant War, Mdama was a shipmaster of the Blight of the Profane. And while he was away, he left the management of his keep, which, for those of you who don't know, the world of Sanghelios, or the Sanghelis, I guess, society operates off of a keep system of which there is a hierarchy. And he left the keep to Raya, his wife, and her grandbrother, Naxxon. Obviously, during the Human Covenant War, Mdama did not like humanity very well and also followed the teachings of the Sanshayum, or the prophets, similar to many elites. And during the Great Schism, again, similar to many elites, there was a huge rattle in the Covenant religion because, introduced in Halo Glasslands, the Sangheli, or the elites, realized that they had been too reliant on not only the races above them, meaning the Sanshayum, which was formed during the Writ of Union. And for those of you who don't know what the Writ of Union is, that was the original forming and peace between the elites and the prophets that we see in Halo, and what started the Covenant. Because of this reliance on the prophets for developing technology as well as having faith in their religion, the elites did not necessarily form a society that was self-sustaining. And this didn't operate just on the higher level. This actually was a lower level, or a lower race issue as well. When we're introduced to Mdama, at least his first introduction throughout all of the Halo universe, which is in Halo Glasslands, Mdama is going through an issue where he and his fellow elites are debating whether or not they need to eradicate the humans after the Human Covenant War. The problem that many elites are having, and that the Arbiter actually steps in, and which will finally develop into the Civil War battle between the Swords of Sanghelios and the Covenant, or what I should say is Mdama's Covenant, because he actually names his faction after the original Covenant, is that's what develops the situation that we see in Halo 5. Mdama, his wife, as well as many other elites, are discussing whether or not humanity, or they should attack humanity after the events of the Human Covenant War. And finally, the Arbiter, as well as a number of other Kaidons, which are the keep, or I guess the highest ranks of the keeps in the social hierarchy description I provided earlier, say that they are unable to amass a force that would be able to, one, do that, and two, that the races of which they've been relying on for so long for things like agriculture and labor and things like that, which the elites never actually did during the Human Covenant War, or during most of the time of the formation of the original Covenant, were because it was a lesser rank than any male elite ever wanted to be a part of. As we know, the elites are warriors, and they do not want to actually have to be deemed or, condemned to a rank as low as, being a farmer or some sort of agricultural or, just labor worker. They want to be warriors. They want to have honor and bring, a higher status to their, to their keep, as well as their bloodline and their family. Jul 'Mdama and the Arbiter meet during February 1st, 2553, and what ends up happening is the Arbiter, declares that I, now being the sort of savior of the elites, especially after the Great Schism, do not want to go to war with humanity. And because of the discussion that I was speaking about earlier, where the elites do not have the ability to amass a sort of force that would be able to attack the elites without first recuperating and having time, the Jul 'Mdama and the Arbiter kind of butt heads for a minute. Through Sangheili culture and, society, there is always an ability to assassinate whoever is the Kaidan or the new, leader. And that is a right within Sangheili culture and society that they are able to assassinate because they do not agree with it. And if they are successful with the assassination, a new plan is made. And this sort of keeps a debating hierarchy that keeps it keeps it from expanding too far into full-out civil war. Now, because Jul 'Mdama doesn't have the ability to assassinate the Arbiter, Thel 'Vadam, he instead decides to, go with a different plan. And through a lot of Halo Glasslands, and when we're introduced to this character, he decides that his best course of action will be to actually ally with a cult known as the Servants of Abiding Truth. Now, the Servants of Abiding Truth, I won't go into too much detail, but they are still firm believers in the original religion of the Covenant, even after the Human Covenant War. They are extremely, extremely hardcore into that the Forerunners are still there and that faith does not require any explanation despite what's happened with the prophets and everything like that. Now, the key thing that I wanted to mention about Jul 'Mdama, after the post-war and prior to his introduction in Halo 4 or Halo 4 Spartan Ops, is that Jul 'Mdama does not actually believe in the religion of the Forerunners. He is only using the Servants of Abiding Truth as a means to an end. Oddly enough, and, with Jul 'Mdama believing that humanity should be eradicated, and that, just similar to how what we find out in Halo Glasslands, Oni is actually doing the same thing with the Servants of Abiding Truth, i.e. meaning that humans should be eradicated and that they are going to provide weapons to this cult in order for the Servants of Abiding Truth to gain control over pretty much all of Sanghelios and the elites. And so throughout the Halo 5 trilogy and before Halo 4, there's Jul 'Mdama's pretty much quest and story arc of him becoming a part of the Servants of Abiding Truth while still not truly believing in the religion that they believed in before, and sort of ascending the ranks in this cult, and eventually becoming pretty much the supreme leader and deeming it the Covenant. Now, this is probably around the time when we're going to start being introduced to Jul 'Mdama. I mean, there isn't too much that happens other than his imprisonment on Trevelyan. And during his imprisonment in Trevelyan, he actually learns of Requiem and that there is something known as the Librarian and the Janus Key and the Diadact all on Requiem, which will actually give him the ability to know, for those of you who followed Halo 4 Spartan Ops, or more importantly, the Escalation comics, the Absolute Record, which is the real-time location of all Forerunner technology in the galaxy. And for Jul 'Mdama, this couldn't be a better deal because he is still with what was originally known as the Servants of Abiding Truth and became the leader, and now is going to be able to further reinforce his leadership through having, or through being the Diadact's hand, which he knows is on Requiem, as well as finding the Librarian, which Chief runs into in Halo 4, or at least the essence of the Librarian, and then also obtaining the Janus Key, which will give him the location of the Absolute Record, and in turn gives him access to all Forerunner technology. So, as I was saying before, this character really isn't a character that was given the due diligence that I believe that he deserves. There is a high level of in-depth to this character, and prior to the in-game time that we meet him in Spartan Ops, I mean, he really has a lot of good character development. However, by the time we get there, we're only introduced to him as some sort of Covenant faction leader that is, pricking up the remains of, the Covenant, and we're not given the full idea of how in depth and how developed this character is and how much of a threat he could actually pose to the galaxy. He was not necessarily just a replacement for new characters or for new players in Halo 4 to still be fighting the Covenant, which is a known enemy. He actually is a different individual and a different elite with totally different motives and mindsets that are going to go about something that is actually contrary to the Covenant that we were fighting before, who were solely based on faith and religion. So speaking of now his, I guess, start in Spartan Ops, Noah, why don't you pick it up from there and talk about him a little bit from there?
Yeah, so I guess technically the first time we see him, because he's not really mentioned very much, if at all, in Halo 4's main campaign. I mean, I think the only glimpse of him we get is during the, I believe it's called the Didact Cometh. It's the cutscene where the Didact awakens. And so, besides that brief glimpse of someone who looks a little different than the rest of the elites, we don't really know much about him until we start with the Spartan Ops campaign, which is essentially just picking up where we left off with the Infinity running a ground operation on Requiem, trying to stop Jul Mdama's forces from gaining access to, like you were saying, the Librarian and the Janus key, as well as the location of all these different Forerunner artifacts and technology. Since this different splinter faction of the Covenant is heavily based upon, that faith in the Forerunners. So, as we pick up with Mdama, we're introduced to the fact that he is, in fact, the leader of this new Covenant. You can tell right away. You can tell that he has authority. He's a very powerful looking figure. He has a very unique look. If you ever paid attention to his armor, he has that glowing blue circle. He has that Didact's hand signet on his chest and the rest of his armor, which is a really cool emblem, actually. And so during Spartan Ops, you're basically playing as the fire team, Spartan fire team that's just assigned to defend different strategic points or just prevent Jul Mdama from succeeding. And so throughout that campaign, you'll watch Jul as he captures a scientist, and this is actually kind of like a prologue to Halo 5 in a way, because in the end, it ends up with, of course, Halsey manipulating Jul in a little bit of a way and becoming captured by him in a sense. And as you see later, eventually, Palmer takes a shot at Halsey, which, critically wounds her arm, and then eventually you see that the arm has to be amputated, which is where the state that we see her in Halo 5 at the beginning. And so Spartan Ops was that first chance to really see him. He got his first lines of dialogue, but even then he really wasn't given the proper spotlight he really needed to shine, because like you've been saying, he's a really complex, well-written character that's, one that's just kind of hidden amongst the lore just because there's so much out there, but he just didn't get enough time to shine. Just because, and even now, I never really knew there was that much of, like, I guess, a cult following towards this particular character. I knew that people liked his idea, but I guess I would never really been exposed to his backstory, and reading about all the things that he went through and what he does. It's just such an interesting character, just because of how different he is. He's definitely, just for the fact that he is a shipmaster, you can tell that he is a respectable warrior just for achieving that rank, because we know that that's very difficult to achieve, and that's something that most St. Healy would be thrilled with, getting to that point. And not only that, but a lot of the time that we see Jul, we actually see him on the ground leading his forces personally, which again is something that shows that he's a very good warrior, especially with those initial contacts with the Forerunner Promethean forces. So we know that he's an important guy, and with that, it's just a shame that we didn't see the rest of him and just more development.
Yeah, and speaking of his development, I mean, the Halo 4 with the elites had a new look to them. I don't know if you guys necessarily remember, but I actually made a video a little bit back about, the old Covenant art style returning possibly in Halo Infinite. And with that, I based a lot of my theory on the fact that Atriox and the mercenaries that were under him actually were comprised of not only the new look, but the old look as well of the elites, which was really nice. And Actually, if you read the Halo Escalation comic books, there is also a mix of the old and new look, which is actually called the phenotype. And for those of you who don't know or haven't seen that video, as a quick summary, the phenotype of the elites are pretty much a genetic variation that has given a different appearance to the, I guess, same species of that planet. However, they still are able to commingle and whatnot. And within this new phenotype, unfortunately, as we've talked about before in Halo 5, the art style or whatnot that we talk about, where the Arbiter looks different. We talk about the more hunched over posture versus the more stand up that we see in like Halo 2 and Halo 3. So with that, we can also see that the Covenant, or the elites that Jul Mdama is bringing together, were very similar to Atriox. I mean, we talked about Atriox in the Halo Wars in the Spirit of Fire podcast that we did, and that the people that he was bringing together were or the elites that he was bringing together were from different races. I mean, they're not just the elites, but yeah, the Juralhane, which are the brutes, and many different forces. Unfortunately, like we were saying, you keep saying that due to the lack of in-game exposure and time to develop, Jul Mdama had a very, very similar stance on that. He had a very similar composition of forces that he was able to do, or that he was able to bring together due to the situations that we see in Halo Glasslands and in Halo Escalation, because Halo Escalation, in fact, is the continuation of pretty much Spartan Ops in many senses, or at least in many respects. But before we jump to that, there's actually another character that's there that we meet very early on in Halo 4 Spartan Ops, which is Gek Lar. And he actually has some ties to Halo Smoke and Shadow and Halo Renegades. Noah, if you wanted to jump on that really quick before I finished up with the Spartan Ops deal.
Yeah, so Gek Lar, we can see, is sort of you get the idea that he's sort of the second in command. He's one of Jul's most trusted warriors. And he's basically what I would say is like the equivalent of the Darth Maul of the Halo series, in the sense that he's this really cool looking guy. He has such a unique design, and there's so many different, scars. The way he looks, he doesn't wear a helmet. He has the dog tags of his victims attached to his armor. Just all these different things that scream like they're telling a story. But unfortunately with him, the stories never really came about. And he did meet his demise rather quickly within the Spartan Ops story. But thankfully, due to some expanded media, we've started to get some more info on him and some more expansion onto who he was and what he's done. And so we know that basically he was one of the Sangheili that just despised humanity. And you could tell in the way that his actions, of course, the way he keeps those trophies, and just his interactions with one of the other characters we've talked about a lot, which is Ryan Forge. Because, like you were saying, he actually does make his appearance within the Smoke and Shadow set of novels. You get the expansion on what he's been up to. He controls this, essentially a salvage crew that goes around with a heavy destroyer, I believe it was. And, of course, he interacts with Ryan Forge. You could tell that he had already captured, I believe it was Ram Chalva, was it?
I believe so.
And so he had taken a prisoner onto his war freighter. You could tell from this treatment of Ram and the rest of his crew that, like I was saying, he just despises humanity. It was part of that sort of splinter faction that really didn't want to accept that the war was over. And then, of course, we learned that he was involved within a terrorist attack on Earth. And eventually we also learned that he was actually detained and interrogated at the Midnight facility, which we just had an extensive discussion on.
Yeah, and that's something that, I mean, nobody we know escapes from. Absolutely, yeah. So it kind of attests to like his character, his second command. It identifies him with Jul on the level of his hatred for humanity, because he's even seen that kind of, thing that he's seen the worst of humanity and what they can do. So, but please feel free to continue.
Yeah, and so like you were saying, the fact that he was able to escape from this facility, and not only that, but allegedly he was able to kill a decent amount of personnel in his escape. So that just is a testament to what he's capable of and why he's earned that position with Jul's Covenant. And so, of course, he does see his demise at the end of towards the end of the Spartan Ops campaign, and So there's nowhere for his story to go. Essentially, all we could get is more expansion into his background, which again would be nice considering how interesting this character's appearance is, and how he's set up to be, how cool he's set up to be. So with Geklar, we get to see, like you're saying, that just because following up the Hunt the Truth podcast with this sort of topics was actually really perfect, just because like you're saying, along with Jules' story, it really expands on what Oni's done and why they're the bad guys, just because of how they've treated the Sangheili and the different things. But I mean, you do get a sense that just because of how bloody the war was, just because the game's perspective doesn't always, again, we've talked about that multiple times, you're just in the eyes of one person, so you don't really get to see everything. And so with the expanded media, we get an idea of how just bloody and terrible this war for survival was, because, the Covenant was bent on just eradicating humanity, and humanity was, of course, fighting for survival. So deep hatreds would, of course, develop, and we don't really get a sense of that besides maybe the end of Halo 3, where Lord Hood and Arbiter are talking about how they can't really forgive each other, but whatever. And so besides that, throughout Halo 3's campaign, you're allied with the elites and you're fighting alongside them. So it doesn't always come across just how deep these divides would be. And so I think that the expansion of that with both Jewel Mdama and Geklar has been something that's fantastic. And I think everybody should dive into these two characters if they get the chance.
Like you said, they don't just interact within their own story arcs. I mean, within Smoke and Shadow, not giving away too much, but he commits a huge act or at least Gek commits a huge act at the end of Smoke and Shadow, and at the beginning of Renegades, we see him picking up the Harvester at an auction, which, that's kind of something that Ryan Forge doesn't want him to get a hold of, because she knows how devastating that could be. And we see that in Spartan Ops, and we know now what Jewel Mdama was using it for, which was to gain access to facilities on Requiem. And kind of dialing back then to back on Requiem, I mean, the whole point of Jewel Mdama being there was so that he could gain access to the librarian and find the Janus key, as well as find the Didact as well. And with the Janus key, we know that it gives the real-time location of all Forerunner technology throughout the universe. And so I find it pretty amazing that Jewel Mdama was able to, knowing how bad humanity is, detesting humanity and this and that, is able to formulate a plan still for what he believes is the good of his people. Like you're saying, deep hatred runs through both sides of the human covenant war, with humanity and many people in the outer colonies, like in Hunt the Truth, like what we were talking about with I believe it was Savient Sunrise is what they were called, that faction that didn't want there to be peace talks between Sangheili and humans. And now we see it also with the extent to which it could be with Jewel Mdama. And so he's going this far. He's not necessarily betraying his own kind, but he's doing what he believes is right for his survival of his own kind. And on that subject, I mean, I could talk about this for days. Probably will be a future podcast, is Oni. And what Oni does at the beginning of Halo Glasslands, which is literally incite the Covenant Civil War. I mean, Parangoski, who is the head of Oni, and Osman, who actually we hear a little bit of at the end of Hunt the Truth, are the ones who incite the Civil War on Sanghelios and pretty much give the ability for all of that to start and all of that to come up. And later, in Halo 5, we hear that, from Captain Lasky, that Brass doesn't want anything to do with the Civil War, their war, yet it was Oni that started the war. And so, I mean, in a sense, Jewel Mdama is right. Humanity and Oni are going to manipulate everything for their continued existence, and are literally on the same, parallel lines of thinking in this sense. So, his resort, or his goal, is to, similar to the Prophets, is to gain as much Covenant or Forerunner technology as possible using this Janus key. And at the end of Spartan Ops, like you're saying, we saw his contact with, or at least Catherine Halsey's contact with the librarian, and his gaining of at least one piece of the Janus key. And, Dr. Halsey at that point is kidnapped, and Sarah Palmer, takes a shot and actually, wounds, I believe it's her left arm, and, that's later amputated. However, through the Escalation comics, I mean, we then are given just another huge expansion onto the incredible lore of this character, and the back and forth that even Dr. Halsey ends up, knowing that Jul Mdama is not actually a devout follower of, this religion. He's doing it as a means to an end, and because of the ability of what he's doing with the librarian and the Janus key, he is able to still have a firm grip over the covenant and the devout followers of this religion that, like you're saying, they don't want it to end, they don't want it to exist. They've known it pretty much all of their lives, and that's how they've lived, and is doing it for the betterment of what he believes is the betterment of his people. But towards the end of Halo Escalation, we start getting to the absolute record, and the absolute record, as I keep mentioning, is it's going to give the real time location of every Forerunner piece of technology and give him access to it as well. And pretty much Dr. Halsey, as you were saying, manipulates Jul Mdama, telling him that once he's in control of the absolute records, installation and everything that it has to offer, that he will pretty much be seen as a god. Yet we know that Jul Mdama doesn't necessarily want to be seen as a god, other than for the act of keeping a grip over his version of the covenant. And that'll actually lead me into another point later in the podcast, where Locke kind of makes a comment about how Jul Mdama isn't really a leader, and that his covenant would eventually crumble. I really hate to see that comment, because I don't really believe that it was actually there, but it was something that, without seeing all the backstory and whatnot to the game, or at least to the games, and seeing with what Jul Mdama's done throughout Glasslands and Escalation and Spartan Ops, that you wouldn't have a respect, and you would believe it really just kind of pushes Jul Mdama that much farther down on the rank of, or I guess on the I don't know how to view, I guess, the vision, the level of power level of the character, like the due diligence that he deserved, and his intricacy as a character. And so with the absolute record at the time, we see characters in Halo 5 like, Halle Tanaka and Sarah Palmer there, as well as characters that return from Spartan Ops, Spartan Thorn and Dr. Glassman. And through there, I don't want to totally ruin Escalation for anyone that hasn't been there, but long story short, the absolute record is lost, and unfortunately, the losing party is supposed to be contained, and Jul Mdama escapes, as well as with Dr. Halsey, and like you said, is where we meet her in Halo 5. And kind of speaking about that stuff, why don't you kind of talk a little bit about Halo 5 and what we kind of get with him in that, because I mean that's pretty much the end of his story. Unfortunately, he can't go any farther than there.
Yeah, so like you were saying, with the way that he's treated with Halo 5, it's just kind of a step back from what we've been taught about him and just what we know about that character. And so essentially we see Fireteam Osiris's mission as the opening mission of the game. You're given the objective to rescue Dr. Halsey, and so at the end of the mission, you're treated to a cutscene in which Fireteam Osiris handily dispatches of both Mdama and his guards. And we've talked about that cutscene quite a bit, and I would love to talk about it more, just because of how, well, just unfortunate it was, just because this deep character that had so much potential, it could have gone so many different ways, this character that so many people ended up taking an attachment to, just because of how interesting and unique his story was. It just gone like that in the blink of an eye. And so, of course, like we were discussing, one of the reasons for that might have just been to say how cool Fireteam Osiris is, but in the end, it probably ended up hurting Halo lore more than it benefited it, really, just because of how easy he was able to be taken down. And I know a lot of people make the argument, oh, well, Mdama was more of a manipulative type. He wasn't really a warrior, but I mean, that doesn't really make sense given what we know about him, just because of the fact that within the Sangheili culture, to achieve the rank of shipmaster is a massive achievement. And not only that, but like I was saying, we do see him on the ground leading his troops personally. So that doesn't really strike me as the type of guy that's more of a coward and manipulator. But yeah, like I was saying, he just is able to be defeated by Locke way too easy. And I don't know if you had any different opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, like you're saying with him in his character development, despite his hatred and distrust for humanity as a whole, I mean, Jul Mdama was willing to work with certain human individuals like Halsey, and when it was necessary to benefit his goal. And he also didn't, he knew English, which is a human language. And throughout, Sangheili culture and whatnot, and through the previous religion, you're not supposed to speak English. Like that is something there that kind of just attests to that. Although Julam Dama often displayed like typical Sangheili aggression, it didn't hesitate a lot. He still was able to accomplish his goal. He could be both patient and highly manipulative. And you see this during his during his captivity on Trevelyan, where he was able to trick his human captors by behaving according to their expectations of his species. He is manipulative, and he also gains information from Oni while he is there. So to have him just kind of be thrown under the bus here in Halo 5, at least that's what I believe, and creating a sort of Star Trek, I believe I mentioned this before on the podcast, the Worf effect, where an enemy comes in and in a new episode, and in order to display their power level or how strong they are, they decide to go after a character named Worf, who's supposed to be like 3 times as strong as a human and faster as well. And here, when Spartan Locke is introduced, I don't, like you're saying, I don't think it really benefited, unfortunately, any sort of Halo lore to have Julam Dama die in this moment, to have him be killed by Spartan Locke, because in one respect, even I, when I was playing the game initially, didn't understand the full extent of Julam Dama and all of his history and whatnot. And then, furthermore, to have Locke, even though Nightfall was a thing that had happened, be introduced with Fireteam Osiris, and the first thing they do in game is to kill Julam Dama, in the way that they did, it seemed like with such ease, really kind of pushed it down. And talking about that stuff, it would be nice to kind of go back then and just talk more about his covenant and what he did. I mean, like I'm saying here, with everything that happened, despite this being a Sangheili and just having that kind of aggression and mindset that what goes on, he was disillusioned with the Covenant's religion, just like any other Sangheili after the Great Schism. And no longer did he didn't believe in the Great Journey anymore, but he came to accept the fact that the Forerunners weren't gods. And this actually puts him, at least in my head, on a parallel line with the Arbiter. Yet the only difference between him and the Arbiter is their disgust and his hatred for humanity. And while like many elites, he liked the comfort of the old belief that the Forerunners were gods, he saw that they made mistakes and that they weren't divine. And in that, his character arc starts and it builds, and so he's able to take control of the cult, of the servants of abiding truth, and he's able to become, like you're saying, rise through the ranks. He's not just another normal elite. He's not just a, character or, enemy that was introduced that they kind of just put in a position. He did have a good story arc and a good character development build behind him when he was doing that. And so it really just sucks to see that his story arc had to end at the beginning of Halo 5, and that he wasn't flushed out as much as he could have been with all of the extent that they put into him, especially in the extended Halo media and whatnot. I mean, he does have a very intricate storyline that, again, I don't really want to ruin too much with Halo Glasslands or the Kilo 5 trilogy, as well as the end of the Halo Escalation comics, because those are all great reads and they go in depth. And again, the extended Halo media, as we've talked about before, is some of the best parts about the Halo universe, is because of how well and how in depth they go into stuff like that. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about with this Covenant before we moved on?
Yeah, I think your comparison to the Arbiter was actually really interesting to note, just because of the fact that, yeah, essentially we see 2 elites on 2 different sides of the schism, because both of these guys realized that the prophets were manipulating them. However, they took 2 completely different approaches to that. The Arbiter chose to ally himself with humanity in order to move on from this war. And then we have Julam Dama, who chose to continue on the quest to just dispatch of humanity, essentially. So we see those 2 different stories play out, and we see how perfect Julam Dama was for basically the nemesis or rival of the Arbiter. And so that's what a lot of people were mad about too with Halo 5, is the fact that we didn't get to see all of these rumblings and building up culminate into a final showdown between Delvedon and Julam Dama, because that would have probably been the only way people really would have been satisfied with Mdama's demise, I think, in a sense, just because that would have been not only a personal moment for the Arbiter, but really just the final steps for Mdama, the only places he really could have gone without just being, a tool to say, here, look how cool Fireteam Osiris is.
And it would have given, I believe, the Arbiter a little bit more, I guess, action in Halo 5 that we didn't really get to see with him because, I mean, during those levels, like, those are your favorite levels in Halo 5 or, the St. Helios levels. And to see, rather than, Fireteam Osiris immediately, kill Jul 'Mdama and, I guess, rescue Dr. Halsey, it would have been nice to see more of like a extraction from from Jul 'Mdama to kidnap Dr. Halsey and to have then Jul 'Mdama and the Arbiter go at it later because to give him even some time in Halo 5 to develop, maybe to add, to fill in for the players who don't, read any of the extended Halo lore or the Halo media, to know why Jul 'Mdama was doing that stuff in Halo 4. Unfortunately, it is a lot of backtracking, but still, it is something that's a crucial fact that many players would have needed to know, and it would have given it a lot more of a intense battle for when Jul 'Mdama and the Arbiter finally met because despite Jul 'Mdama's personal loss and the faith of Forerunners as gods, he puts on a very convincing public image of of a devout religious leader in the eyes of his followers, and his awareness of many loopholes and contradictions in Sangheili honor and religion and culture is able to he's able to circumvent a lot of the cultural rules without sullying his reputation. And like I say, it just makes him such an interesting character that someone who is the head and kind of manipulating the covenant, the ends of a covenant religion, and doing what some might consider good, despite it being something that's bad. At least it's good for the elites, and that though it was though he's uncomfortable with like his charade, he rationalizes it throughout the Kilo 5 trilogy by telling himself that not only is this deception necessary, but the only thing he was truly lying about was his own faith, or you would say like the lack of having faith. And it was something that like he goes on a little bit, especially in the Thursday War, that he considers a personal issue. And so at some point, when Halsey actually confronts him, when they're in private, it says like, I know that you're not, you don't believe in the covenant religion. He doesn't even press the issue. And, he's able to, just like the Arbiter, stand out from the other elites and just have a totally different, respect for him, at least as an antagonist, at least as an enemy in the Halo universe, and one that could actually be very formidable, and that he is not, just as I was saying earlier in the podcast, a substitute so that Halo 4 players are still familiar with some enemy at the introduction of Halo 4. It's not just a remnants of a covenant covenant faction. I kind of wish that they had not named the Jul 'Mdama's covenant the covenant, that they had named him something different, just to sort of differentiate them a little bit and give them a more backstory similar to the Banished in Halo Wars 2. And even in their battle of Sinion, when that's going on, it would have been great to see that. I mean, like I said, those are your favorite levels in the game, and to see that more developed would have been something that I think you have some serious opinions on, and that you kind of had some things that you wanted to talk about there too.
Yeah, because basically that entire arc could have essentially just been expanded upon. That could have, like you were saying, to give Jul 'Mdama more time to develop. If we've talked about that a number of times, where Halo 5 Guardian should have just been Halo Guardians, and it essentially be just a spin-off title. And if that were the case, you could have just seen that arc more fleshed out. And had Jul 'Mdama been alive, the Battle of Sinion would have had a lot more weight. Because, that is the end of the Covenant. That's it. They're done. Mdama's dead by this point, and there's very little holding them together. But if Mdama were to have been alive in this final assault, that the Arbiter's finally going to get the chance to put an end to this rebellion, this civil war on St. Helios, find peace for his people. If, all that buildup was there for that confrontation, and not only that, but we would have potentially gotten the chance to see Mdama reacting to the fact that everything he'd worked so hard to build, everything he'd done, everything he just worked to, all in the belief that he was doing the right thing, just for him to see all of that crumbling around him as he loses this fight against the Swords of St. Helios. And just to have that would have just been the perfect way to give weight to not only that battle, again, to the Civil War of St. Helios, to give Mdama a chance to shine as this sort of tragic character in a sense, because his life isn't exactly perfect. The reason he doesn't like humanity, well, there's a lot of reasons, of course. Like we see, he's tortured by Oni. His wife is murdered while he's in prison. All sorts of just tragic things happen to this guy. And to see, it would have just been nice to see that reaction, to see him, broken in a sense and defeated totally.
It would have just kind of, again, attributed to the, like we're saying, the due diligence of a character that we've seen. And not to keep going into theoreticals of what, Halo 5 could have been, but as a final note on that, to have Halo 5 Guardians be just Halo Guardians and not really focus on the Chief, maybe just in extended, kind of terminals or, in hidden situations, but to rather just look at the Halo universe after the Human Covenant War and after the return of Chief, could have presented a number of just immaculate opportunities that it could have fixed a lot of things that people weren't necessarily happy with in Halo 4, or if they weren't happy with, clarified it, furthermore. I mean, we've seen that in the Halo novels, like the Rookie's death and why Mickey did it from, New Blood to Bad Blood, and it really kind of gave a good sense of, like, not atonement, but a good sense of consolidation for why that happened, and now we even see the return of Mickey. So to have that in-game and to kind of put the Halo universe all back in perspective for everybody, it could have just been a really good idea, and something that, personally I'd like to elaborate on. But currently with the podcast, Jul Mdama, focusing on him could have really added to his story and could have fixed him up really well to shape for, a very dramatic and very climatic battle in Halo 5. So kind of wrapping up with that, was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we finished up on the podcast?
No, I think that about covers it. Just surprised how cool this character was. It was really fun diving into him and learning more, and I'm so glad that this topic was suggested. It's been an interesting ride.
Thank you so much for suggesting this topic. It was a really fun topic to go into and to develop more knowledge on as a character, and knowing that even the characters that we think that we might not like in the Halo universe actually have likable qualities, actually have amazing things about them. And speaking of that, Sarah Palmer is one that I'm really actually looking forward to. That's a podcast that I think that with more reading into Halo Escalation and developing a better backstory and character development with could do something very similar to what we've seen here. So I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. Remember, every Wednesday I'll be releasing these at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Feel free to come join us on our Discord if you ever want to talk about anything similar to what we're talking about now on the podcast. I'll leave a link in the description below. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.